Heavy is the head that wears the crown, a phrase that implies the responsibilities put upon those in charge weigh on them constantly. Whether it is something smaller scale, to the more personal level, to being a parent, caring for a child, being responsible for meeting every single one of that child's needs as they progress throughout life, to the more wider scale, to being responsible for an entire country or kingdom and every single person living there, where every single one of your choices could have everlasting effects for each of those people, and those consequences could be felt long after your life has ended. Whatever the responsibilities may be, the more that are put upon those in charge, the heavier that crown weighs. Even still, though, the responsibilities that they face are normally day to day. They will deal with it as they come, and though they can think about what they might face in the future, that normally remains unknown. But when the knowledge becomes known of what choices you will face in the future, that crown becomes so heavy that it could become crippling. Something that could make you unable to act even in the present and take a single step forward. This is the dilemma that is faced in The Indecisive King, aka The King, the Crown, and the Widow, one of the fairy tales of Remnant. Once upon a time, there was a very wise king. Every morning, the king would open up his court to the citizens that he ruled over, allowing them to air their grievances, ask him for advice. And the only requirement to do so, to ask the king for his wisdom, is that whatever the response he gave, they would have to obey. Many came to seek the king's advice, with questions ranging from the simple and day-to-day all the way to the complex and life-changing. Simple examples, such as one individual who came exclaiming that a tree had fallen from his neighbor's yard, had crushed his fence and half of it still lay in his own yard, and asked the king who should pay to remove the tree and to repair the fence. The king replied that this was an easy problem to fix. The tree, the half of it that lied on his own yard now, would belong to him. He and his neighbor would split the wood evenly, and both use some of it to repair the fence. The rest they would sell and keep the profits to themselves, though some of the profits would be used to replace the tree that had fallen and plant a new one. For the king was very wise, both of the neighbors understood and listened to his advice. But then there were more complex issues, such as one woman who came in one day in tattered clothes with a disheveled look on her face. She had told the king that the creatures of Grimm had attacked her, had killed her entire family. Everything that she had cared for was now gone. And she asked the king, what should she do now? The king went over to her and clasped her hand in his own, looked at her for a short while, and smiled sadly and told her, "You need to keep on living." The widow had no choice but to listen to the king's advice. But the king was not only wise, but also very generous. He offered the widow the castle to stay in, offered her a warm bed and a place to grieve, and told her when she's ready to come back and ask her question again. So the widow accepted his offer, stayed in the castle, was given warm clothes, some food to eat, and a place to stay. For weeks she spent just sleeping, eating, and crying. But eventually she took interest in the court, and in particular took some interest in the kindly king, watching him day to day as he would answer each of the citizens' questions, not only listening to their grievances, but also listening to their hearts, and would always see the truth of the situation. Very often, people and citizens who had heeded the king's advice would come bearing gifts for the king. Often, the king, very humble, would encourage others to give to those in need, but he was also gracious enough to accept, thinking that he could always use these gifts to give to those in need who came seeking his own advice. But one day, a man with wild eyes appeared in the court, and when it was his turn to speak, he offered the king a silver crown. The king initially refused, saying, "I already have a crown," but the man replied, "Not one like this one. Honestly, you'd be doing me a favor by taking it, and as the wisest king in the land, you are the only one suited to possess it." The king said, "You flatter me," but still refused to take the crown. The man insisted, though. "Allow me to come closer and I'll explain." The king, intrigued by what the man was saying, allowed him to do so, and whisper in his ear. The king asked him, "How did you come by this crown?" The man replied, "It doesn't matter. Will you accept?" The king had become curious about this crown and the man himself, so he allowed the man to place the crown upon his head. The king closed his eyes, and only a moment later tore the crown from his head and jumped from his seat, his skin as pale as the moon. "What is this?" he cried, and told the guards to seize that man. but the man had already disappeared. "Find him," he sputtered as he collapsed back in his throne. He put the crown back on his head and continued to stare blankly into the distance. There were still about a dozen others, though, waiting to seek his advice, but the king had become non-responsive, so the attendants simply told them it's best that they come back tomorrow. But the next day came and the court opened, and for the first time in as long as people could remember, the king was late to appear in court. And when he did appear, he had a disheveled appearance. There were dark bags under his eyes, and he seemed distracted and not all there when he was answering their questions. One of the people asked about his daughter, that his daughter wanted to marry her childhood friend, but he was the son of a baker, and the father had hoped that she would marry of higher status. The man asked the king, "What should I do in this situation?" The king thought for a moment and asked a question in return. "Are the boy's parents good bakers?" The man frowned. "I suppose so, yes." "Then what more could you ask for? Let your daughter be happy and enjoy free bread." The man hadn't considered that possibility before and thanked the king for his wisdom. As he turned to leave, though, the king stopped him. "Wait, perhaps I was wrong. A family needs more than just bread. I think you should follow your instincts and wait for a better match for your daughter." All right. Are you sure?" the man replied. "Of course I'm sure. I'm your king," the king replied. And the man looked around the court, a bit confused, but followed the king's wisdom. The widow was shocked by what she had seen. She had never seen the king doubt himself before, or give bad advice. The servant standing next to the widow seemed to agree with her, but when the widow asked him if he did, the servant simply responded, "Of course not. He is our king," and hurried off. In the days that followed, the king continued to second-guess himself, and the advice he gave to those who sought it became more and more erratic. Eventually, it came to the point where the king stopped accepting audiences with his citizens altogether, and the widow became increasingly worried about him. Soon after, though, the king started sending out messengers, seeking the wisest philosophers in the land to help him with a dilemma. And whoever was able to help him would have their heart's desire. The only rule that the advisors had to follow was that they not breathe a word of the king's dilemma, for threat of execution. The widow was shocked by this. This didn't sound anything like the king she had come to know. She asked around to the attendants and the stewards to try to find more information about the king's situation, but none of them would say anything for threats of death. The widow realized that all of this had started when the king had obtained that crown, and was able to learn that the crown had been locked away in one of the bottom rooms of the castle, and that the king was the only one who possessed the key. So the widow went and searched around for the only locked door in the basement, and peered through the keyhole, and saw the crown sitting upon a wooden chair. She noted that this was no throne for a king. She decided to hide in the room across the hall and wait for the king, and it didn't take long. He had been meeting with advisors that day and was quick to hurry down and wear the crown once again. She peered through the keyhole once he was inside and saw him sitting on the chair, the crown upon his head, seeming to hold it closer to the ground, as if the weight it was putting upon him was almost unbearable. She saw the king take the crown off his head and throw it across the room, only to run after it, pick it up, and gently place it back on the chair. The widow knocked on the door, and the king rushed over to it and pulled the door open in anger. He grabbed her arm, asking who she was and what she was doing there, and yelled for the guards. The widow told him that half a year ago she had come to him with a question. The king quickly responded, "I don't remember." The widow was saddened to hear this, but continued on. "And you told me that once I was ready to come and ask that question again." The king replied, "I no longer give out advice anymore. I can barely help myself." The widow stood firm, though. "I'm not here to seek your advice, but offer some of my own. You've been seeking people to help you with a dilemma. I am here to offer my attempt." The king was surprised by this, but the widow persisted. "Tell me what's bothering you. Whatever it is, it's too much for one person to bear, and we need our king back." The king thought for a moment and nodded, and told the widow what his dilemma was. "This crown shows me a vision of a crossroads in my future, a decision that I will one day face, and from what I can tell, an impossible one. I just can't seem to find myself to a favorable outcome. This has never happened to me before." The widow simply responded, "Not all outcomes are favorable." The king simply could not accept that. The crown has given him an opportunity, a chance to find the right answer, to work out a solution. But the widow continued. This crown has burdened you with a problem that you are not yet able to handle, and perhaps one that you will never be able to handle. In the meantime, it has paralyzed you with indecisiveness. Even if you are able to work out a solution, you're going to have even more time to wonder if it is the correct one, if there is even a correct one for this problem. The king frowned at this response, but the widow continued further. If you can't come up with answers to simple decisions right now, whether a girl should marry a baker, or if two people claiming ownership of the same pig should split it in two, then what would you do when the moment of decision actually comes, if it ever comes? She picked up the crown. This is no gift. This is a curse. The king sat back in his chair. Then what should I do? The widow smiled. You must keep living. The king sighed. That's good advice. And the widow replied, you gave me that advice. But you also gave me so much more than that. You gave me my life, hope for a future, and soon afterwards, her face flushed, a reason for living. She held up the crown. May I? The king held up a hand. You don't want to do that. The widow replied, forgive me if just this once I do not heed your excellent advice. She put the crown upon her head, closed her eyes, and saw the king in front of her yet again, except he seemed different than he did now, and looked at her differently, and there was a decision that he was posing to her at that time. Yes, she breathed. Yes, what? The king asked. Let's wait and discover that question together, she replied. I imagine my vision was quite different from yours. Excuse me? The king said. Forget it, the widow said, as she placed the crown on the ground, resisting the urge to stomp on it. If you want my honest advice, I recommend you lock this thing away and throw away the key. Live your life. Trust in yourself to make the right decision when the moment comes, given all of the information you currently have at hand. Or allow yourself to make a mistake, comforted in the knowledge that you tried your very best. In either case, the future is of your own making. Allow myself to make a mistake? The king asked. The widow took the king's hand and pulled him to his feet, just as you gave me permission to go on living when my life had changed forever. The king looked up at her. I think I do remember you. Good, the woman replied. Once upon a time there was a very wise king, and an even wiser queen. This fairy tale, as with all of the others in the fairy tales of Remnant, carries with it a number of underlying messages. In Ozpin's notes, he goes over the simple message that sometimes bad things happen to good people. But delving further into that sometimes one thing that can be helpful for one person can be harmful to another, that the crown can harm or help the user, or both at the same time, demonstrating that the veil between good and evil is very thin after all. We also see that knowledge is power, something that is definitely seen throughout the world today, but too much knowledge can make someone powerless, unable to decide what is right or wrong or what would be the best way to face a decision. It is what you do or don't do in that certain situation that really matters, what you do with power, what you do with knowledge, etc. But the most important message from this fairy tale is that no matter what life deals you, no matter what decisions you must face, you always just have to keep living. The Indecisive King likely also has a grain of truth within it for the RWBY series, something that actually happened or actually exists within the world, the most likely of which being the crown of choice, being the relic of choice. It seems very likely that the abilities described are that of the relic of choice that we will see at some point in the distant future of RWBY. It's very unlikely that's going to be the next relic we see, as the relic of creation is right at hand. We're probably going to go to Vacuo after that, and then returning to Beacon where everything began seems to be the likely scenario for RWBY, but I already discussed in a previous video what the implications of these abilities of the Crown of Choice are. Now, one thing I will add to that video, though, it seems like the person who wears the crown is only shown a single vision. No matter how many times the king puts on that crown, he is always seeing the same decision or same choice that he will be offered in the future. Once that choice comes and goes, perhaps when he puts on the crown, he will be shown a different choice. So I think this is going to be, or when someone puts on the crown, they will be shown a vision of the most prominent choice currently in their future. Something that will alter the route that their future will take. Something like that. The widow seemingly was shown a vision of the king proposing to her, something that certainly would be life-changing, as after that point she would become a queen and share in the responsibility for the kingdom. Whereas the king was likely shown something extremely different. Being a king, heavy is the head that wears the crown. He's responsible for every one of his citizens. So it could be something relating to a plague or on the brink of war, something like that. Diplomatic relations, a number of different things it could be that would drive him into that corner and make him worry about the future of not only himself, all of his citizens, his kingdom, etc. So this crown definitely could be a helpful item or a very harmful item. But still, there's one other thing I want to focus on that could be a grain of truth in this story. Assuming that this crown is the relic of choice, where's Ozpin in this? Ozpin is the only one who knows of the relics, who knew where they were located. We saw in the RWBY series that he had to go to Jin in one of his previous incarnations and ask her, where are the other relics and what powers do they hold? Likely, in one of Ozpin's previous lives, if he found the relic of choice, he would want to wear the relic of choice to see a decision in his future. Likely something that would be very life-changing. With Salem, the problem with Ozpin, though, he lives many different lifetimes. So the decision that he would face may not actually be in this lifetime, or even the next one. It could be 1,000 years down the road. What would be the most impactful or life-changing decision that would impact his entire future and the route that he would take throughout all those different lifetimes, the goals that he would pursue, etc. So I think, honestly, Ozpin's place in this story is the wild-eyed man that appeared before the king and presented the crown to him. Ozpin, after possibly having worn this crown for an entire lifetime, maybe multiple, trying to figure out an answer for this one decision that is however far off in the future, he decided to present this crown to someone else to see if they could do something better with it. And that happened to be the Wise King. Something like that I could see happening with Ozpin having lived through many different lives. We've seen at least one where he kind of drank himself into oblivion, channeling his inner Crow Bronwyn, but we don't know what he went through in many of those other lifetimes. A lot of them were likely focused on the goal of bringing people together, uniting humanity, and trying to get the relics, resummon the gods, and right the wrongs that have been done in the world. But there were probably others where he gave in to despair, gave in to madness. This relic of choice, if he did wear it for an extended period of time, could likely drive him to madness. As the widow pointed out in this story, the crown possesses a burden, or puts a burden upon the wearer. Sure, they are given opportunity to find an answer to this dilemma that they face, but even if they do find an answer, they're going to have however much time to question it, wonder if that's the right one, wonder if there's a better possibility, or wonder if it's even worth trying at all. And the sad truth with Ozpin, there's absolutely no way to escape this. Even if he tries to take his own life and try to find some way out of this, he will just reincarnate again and again and cannot escape this decision. I could easily see that driving him mad, all the way to the point where he would just give away one of the 4 great relics of the world like that. Not to mention, the man in the story disappeared from standing right in front of the king, surrounded by a courtroom full of people, to the point where the guards weren't able to track him down. Now, this could be because of an invisibility-style semblance or something along those lines, but if Ozpin had reached the breaking point of insanity because of the relic of choice, I don't think he would have a problem using magic in front of people either. So just another little tidbit for thought there. So, I would love to know what your guys' thoughts are down in the comments below. What did you think of the underlying messages in The Indecisive King? Are there any others that you would like to add? And what grains of truth can you draw from this for the RWBY series? Do you think this is actually the relic of choice and the powers that it will have when we see it in the RWBY series? Do you think that Ozpin is the disheveled man that gave the crown to the king? Or any other little grains of truth like that? Where do you think the king and the widow appear in the RWBY timeline? How many years ago did they live? What century? Obviously pre the Great War. This isn't the King of Vale or anything like that, so it likely was long before the Great War, but definitely has a place within the history of Remnant, and I would love to know your thoughts down below. Make sure to subscribe to keep up with everything happening on the channel. Join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7. Also join our Discord server as well, linked in the description below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.